Thank you all for coming today. All of you here in person at Columbia, all of you watching online. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs and director of the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia. And I'm delighted to be here today for the release of the center's latest research output by Ambassador Carlos Pascual, and for the conversation we're going to have today with a really fantastic, distinguished panel of experts. Carlos, as many of you know, served most recently as the top energy official at the U.S. State Department before leaving the administration to join the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia. He's now Senior Vice President at IHS, previously served as the U.S. Ambassador to Mexico and Ukraine, worked in the Clinton administration in the White House as Special Assistant to the President for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia at the National Security Council, worked at the Brookings Institution as the Vice President of Foreign Policy Studies, and launched the Brookings Energy Security Initiative. The question of how to think about the intersection between energy and geopolitics is one that Carlos has been thinking about for, as you can tell from his bio, many, many years. And I've been really privileged to have the chance to talk with him and learn from him about that over many of those years, as well as his colleagues, as one of his colleagues at Brookings, at Columbia, and also in the administration. And the challenge, I think, is when you hold a senior job in government like Carlos had, the day-to-day demands on your time and the heavy travel schedule make it difficult to step back and reflect on some of the broader trends and challenges that are taking place. Just think about how quickly the world has changed since Carlos joined the Obama administration at the State Department. The U.S. shale revolution has upended the global energy market. The impacts of climate change have been felt more frequently and severely than many thought. We've seen conflicts from Russia, Ukraine, to the South China Seas and elsewhere remind us of the connection between energy and geopolitics. So the question is, what do all of these changes mean for energy, for foreign policy, for diplomatic relationships between countries? And so when he left the State Department, we were really thrilled that Carlos used his time to spend at Columbia thinking and reflecting more deeply on some of these questions. And the result is the report that we've released today, which is available on our website, energypolicy.columbia.edu. So Carlos now will come up in a few minutes to present his findings briefly from the report. And then we have an all-star panel of experts to join him up here on stage. And let me just briefly introduce now, so we can move right to the conversation after he's finished, who they are. Iain Conn is the Chief Executive Officer of Centrica, which is the largest supplier of natural gas in the UK, one of the largest suppliers of electricity. Under Iain's leadership, Centrica has expanded significantly here in the United States as well. And so as such, I think Iain has a keen appreciation for the role of geopolitics on energy supply, demand, prices. Before Centrica, he was the head of BP's refining and marketing division, a board member at BP for 10 years, and is chairman of the advisory board of Imperial College Business School, and serves on the boards of several other research and university institutions. Mona Sutphen is a partner at Macro Advisory Partners. She served as the White House Deputy Chief of Staff for the first 2 years of President Obama's administration from 2009 to 2011. Before that, she was managing director at Stonebridge International, a global consulting firm. And earlier was a U.S. Foreign Service officer, served in the Clinton administration at the National Security Council and in other jobs in the White House. She's a member of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, serves on the board of the International Rescue Committee, Human Rights First, and most importantly, the Center on Global Energy Policy, and has been incredibly generous with her time and expertise helping us grow and build, and we're really grateful for all you've done for us. Michael Levi is the David Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and Environment at the Council on Foreign Relations, Director of the Center for Geoeconomic Studies there, and Director of CFR's Program on Energy Security and Climate Change. He's an expert on climate, on energy, on arms control, nuclear terrorism, and much more. Author of numerous books, including The Power Surge, which is one of the best out there, that helps cut through the rhetoric and to understand what to make of the U.S. energy boom that we've seen recently. Part of what we do every day at the center is motivated by a sense that so much of the conversation about energy is motivated and has too much rhetoric, too much hyperbole, and really what we need more is a rigorous analytic approach to understanding these issues, combined with an ability to communicate them clearly and draw out the policy implications of them. And I don't think there's anyone who does that better than Michael does, and we're really thrilled to have him here today. And then finally, Ed Crooks is at the Financial Times, the U.S. Industry and Energy Editor. He joined the FT in 1999 as economics editor, went on to become UK News Editor, and is really one of the most thoughtful, insightful, analytic journalists, I think, out there studying energy markets today. I'm always happy when he calls to talk about an issue or ask for a quote, because I know I'm going to learn more in the conversation than he may learn from me if he learns anything. So we're lucky to have him here with us today to help moderate the conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to Carlos now, and then after he presents, Ed will come up to moderate this conversation. During the course of the conversation, if you have questions, write them on the index cards that are on your chair and pass them out to the aisle, and they'll be brought up to Ed, who will draw from them in the questions he poses to the panel. For those of you watching online, as always, you can participate and ask your questions via Twitter through our hashtag CGEP events, Center on Global Energy Policy, CGEP events. And we'll take questions that way as well. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Carlos Pascual.
Jason, thank you very much. Thank you all for attending this session, and it's a real pleasure to see so many friends and colleagues that I've had in different walks of life, in government, in academia, in the business world. And it comes to reflect one very basic reality. Energy is something which is fundamental to our business interests, to our personal development and growth, to our families. It's central to geopolitical interests. It's central to the way that countries function and operate. And we barely understand how to manage all these issues and bring them together in a set of policies that maximizes the interests that we have as governments and as businesses. And so the challenge to be able to do that is not only phenomenal, but it is vastly important. I'm really thankful to Jason Bordoff, Jason, when he gave me the opportunity to come here and spend a year ago a semester at Columbia University teaching at the Center for Global Energy Policy and at CEPA, and a chance to engage in research was just a phenomenal gift. And Jason, thank you very much. And what you have done for the Center on Global Energy Policy is phenomenal. I don't know how many of you have actually visited the new center, which is about 3 or 4 blocks down on Amsterdam and 122nd. Phenomenal facility and a great opportunity to expand learning and debate and engagement in the community. Congratulations for everything you've done to be able to grow that institution in such a short period of time. The paper that was sent out to you, you have an opportunity to get on the internet, really was born as a result of a set of experiences that I had when I was the coordinator for international energy affairs and the special envoy for energy at the State Department. And one of the events that particularly struck me was in February of 2012. And in that job was one of the first trips that I had made to China. I was extraordinarily excited to go. Gave a talk at the Beijing Energy Club. All of the elite who were there from the Beijing Energy Society were, must have been 150, 200 people there. Really intense buzz, and I thought I was doing a great job of making this presentation of what was happening in the changing energy world, the American energy revolution. And there was one question they wanted to talk about. Given the boom of American energy abundance, will the United States care about the rest of the world? And will we still protect the Middle East? Because from their perspective, 75% of the oil that they had was going through the Strait of Hormuz. And if we weren't going to protect it, then they damn well were, or somebody better. And that was their one fundamental concern. And it wasn't just a question that was being asked in China. It was being asked in the Middle East. And when I came back to the United States, I found it was also being asked by the U.S. military, who was considering whether they should align or realign their investments in the future force structure in a way that just simply assumed that the United States no longer had to be concerned about security of transit lanes. I think over time, some of those questions and issues have been wiped away. There's a perspective that I think started to be acquired throughout the community that you can't just isolate yourself from international markets, that oil in particular is a global commodity, that instability in any part of the world is going to have an impact on prices that we pay in the United States. And therefore, even if we have greater assurance of stability of supply, there are basic questions of economics that still cause the United States to maintain an interest in the stability of the Middle East and the security of transit lanes. Then there's another experience that I had a couple of years later in 2013, and I just finished giving a speech. It was right around the time when Russia had annexed the territory of Crimea in Ukraine. And the question I got then was, isn't the United States, with its energy abundance, aren't we going to use that to punish our enemies and reward our friends? And therefore, aren't we going to come and be Ukraine's savior? And at the same time, use that energy to just flood the international marketplace, depress international prices, and punish Russia for what they had done. And so here we had two completely different scenarios. Energy was a tool for isolation. Energy was a tool for interventionism. And which one was really the case? And how do you work with these issues? And what struck me is that, wow, if you start taking the themes of energy and national security and separate them away from the realities of the marketplace, you can make really phenomenal mistakes that have huge costs in politics and in economics. And as a result of that, I started to step back and ask this question of what can be done to actually get a better understanding of how to manage the intersection of these issues. And the paper that you have to read is really a part of that quest or that journey. And I'm not going to try to go through all aspects of the paper. I think it'll be a lot more fun and a lot more interesting actually to engage with this phenomenal panel. But let me raise 4 different sets of points. The first is sort of an analytic approach to these issues. And then let's take a little bit of a venture and ask the question, how would they apply to Iran? How would they apply to Russia and Ukraine? And how would they apply to the issue of climate change in China, and see if there's some interesting things that we might be able to get out of it. So the first thing I'll leave you with is the rules of 6. And this is the only slide I'm going to show you today. And in each one of these boxes are great words of wisdom that you'll find in the paper. And I tried to actually put them on a slide, and it looked like a bunch of mishmash because it was so tiny, so I didn't try to do it here. But when I started thinking through these issues, one of the things that I found was, in the end, if you look over here along this axis, there's some basic tools that we have to intervene in markets. You can either try to block the exports of countries, you can try to affect the production of countries, you can so-called flood markets, as we were being accused by some of doing in order to punish Russia. You can starve markets, as Russia in some cases have done in 2008, 2009, as was done with Ukraine and European markets. You can assist your friends in order to be able to help them through difficult times. And you can, and this is somewhat new, it isn't an approach that usually is talked about, but you can try to change the fuel mix. And that question becomes particularly important in the question of climate change. But if you're trying to undertake any of these kinds of market interventions, one of the things that becomes very evident very rapidly is that you got to put them against and array them against market conditions. So depending on whether you're dealing with a very large market or a small market, you may have different degrees of flexibility. Whether you're able to cut off investments will be a big factor. So for example, some have argued that in Kurdistan region, if you can sustain investments in the production of energy, it'll eventually create an export route. And so as a result of that, you'll automatically achieve a certain kind of policy change. So investment flows can affect the conditions of the actual market. Whether you can have coalitions, because in most cases, markets are so large that if you don't have a coalition of key actors, you can't sustain the results and you can't have an impact. So the combination of coalition and sustainability have to be looked at together. Speed becomes a big factor because in some cases you can talk a lot about what you're going to do, and if you talk about it for such a long time, you can actually prepare to counter it and undo the impact of what you're trying to achieve. And finally, the question of self-risk, which may not necessarily seem obvious, but if there's a perception that by undertaking an action, you're going to be hurt more yourself, it may unwind or unravel the ability to undertake these actions. And so the thesis that I would like to offer you is that these rules of 6 aren't necessarily going to give you the answers of how to figure out when to undertake interventions or when not. But if you think through the intersections of these factors, you'll have a better chance of understanding when they may succeed or not succeed. Or if you're on the other side of the marketplace and someone is going to take actions that are going to affect you, it may give you a better understanding of what to expect. And if there is that greater transparency between both sides of the marketplace, perhaps you can create an environment for negotiation. And that was the spirit of putting these ideas on the table. So let me start with the issue of Iran's sanctions. I got into this topic in January of 2012. I was the coordinator for international energy affairs. Legislation had passed where the United States had passed sanctions on Iran. Europe was about to do the same thing. There were working groups with the Department of Energy, with the Department of Treasury, and I had the responsibility for formulating the diplomatic and leading the diplomatic strategy in order to undertake this. There were certain basic things that we had to work with. There was legislation that required us to reduce the amount of exports that were coming from Iran. There was already legislation that had been passed in previous years that was a constraint on investment. But the challenge we've really faced was, how do you take this, formulate a coalition, sustain that coalition, and not inject so much self-risk that the impact on the market was going to result on those of us who were imposing the sanctions paying the cost as a result of an increase in the price of oil. And the tool that we decided to use in order to pursue these issues was one of choice. It may seem unusual, but what we decided was that if there were 20 countries that were importing Iranian oil, and if the task was to get them all to curtail their imports, you can either go and try to dictate to them and say you have to cut it back, or you can give them a choice and say, what do you want to do and what's good for you? And so the approach that we generally took was we said, look, here's a known. There are sanctions that have been passed by the U.S. government. The European Union is about to do the same thing, eventually did the same thing. There is a certain unknown, which is how unreliable Iran might become as a supplier. And then there was finally an option. Do you want to diversify your source of oil? And at this point of time, how dependent do you want to be on one of the countries which is a principal target of geopolitical instability throughout the world? What's that going to do to the stability of your energy supplies? And what are the implications for your energy security in the future? And that combination of diversification and self-interest, combined with the fact that countries knew that there were sanctions, led to every single one of those countries that was importing oil from Iran reducing their imports. And interestingly enough, the average amount that was reduced was far greater than what we would have had if the Congress had actually legislated a particular target that we had to work toward. So let's accelerate ahead to the year 2015. Very different environment in which we are working in. Negotiations are taking place over a period of years between the P5, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, and Germany, together with Iran, to be able to reach a deal that would create greater transparency in the Iranian nuclear program, assure that it was only for civilian purposes, and in exchange for that would give Iran sanctions relief and allow it to come more fully into the international community or international markets, particularly for energy. And in those negotiations, the leverage that had been achieved through sanctions was key. At one point, the amount of oil that Iran was exporting went from 2.5 million barrels a day in January of 2012 to a low point of 1 million barrels a day. At $100 a barrel, that's about $4.5 billion a month. That leverage, I would argue, was fundamentally a factor that led to greater flexibility and capacity to negotiate, to bring Iran to the negotiating table, and to move forward into those negotiations. The interesting thing about it was that at a certain point, that leverage would begin to be eclipsed. As soon as you had a deal, then you had reached the point where countries had reached an understanding of how you can deal with a nuclear problem, and hence the presumption was that you can find a way to move forward and resolve the issue, and you should move out of sanctions. Or if you failed to reach that deal, then the question became, is it worth going over, continuing to move forward? And so there was this challenge, this balancing point of how do you reach a deal at a point when your leverage is high, and how do you do it before you begin to break the unity around the sanctions that could eliminate your leverage from moving forward? And here China was key. And the reason it was key was that Chinese were very smart. They had conducted all of their trade with Iran on energy through one trading company, which was already sanctioned. They ran all of their financial transactions through one bank, which was already sanctioned. And so from a Chinese perspective, if you had a deal and the deal didn't work or the United States backed out of it, well, they tried to do their part, and they can go forward and go ahead and sanction me because it would have no impact, because we've already been sanctioned. Or you get to a point where it's simply impossible to go forward, and we're not going to sustain this coalition any longer. I would submit that we reached the deal on Iran at just about the perfect point. If this process had continued, I think it would have become harder and harder to maintain unity among the countries. Once having reached that deal, I think we reached the maximum point of leverage, and the idea of going back and renegotiating to achieve another deal would have simply become harder and if not impossible. And so the issue that we were left with was a deal achieved at a point of maximum leverage, and it leaves us with a judgment. Was enough done to, in fact, move further out that breakout point for Iran that moved its ability to produce a nuclear weapon from 2 or 3 months to a year? Had enough been done to reduce the amount of uranium available to Iran, to reduce the number of centrifuges that it had spinning? Had enough been done to be able to bring transparency in inspections? And here was a critical issue. Had the agreement been structured in a way in which the snapback provisions were sufficiently strong to allow the agreement to come back, to allow sanctions to come back into place if there was a violation? And the result was quite extraordinary, frankly, because the way it was structured was that it allowed any member of the UN Security Council to make the argument that Iran had violated the agreement, and at that point in time submit a proposal for a snapback of the sanctions. And in order to roll them back, in order to roll back those sanctions, the UN Security Council would have to vote on a resolution that agreed to take the sanctions back, to block the reimposition of the sanctions. The United States or any other country that was one of the P5 would still have the opportunity to veto that resolution. In effect, it created a situation where if the United States felt that there was backtracking, the ability to apply the snapback provisions was something that was virtually guaranteed by the arrangements. I personally think that it was a deal that will serve the interests of the United States and serve the interests of the international community. But I also think that if we apply the rules of six to this kind of an environment, it will help us better understand at what point can a deal like this be sustainable or not, and how to potentially achieve it. Let me say a couple of things about Russia, Ukraine, and the sanctions. The situation with Russia was very different. With Iran, they had been producing about 3.3 million barrels a day. They had been exporting about 2.5. Russia was exporting 10.5 million barrels of oil a day, more than, at that point, arguably any other country in the world, jockeying back and forth with Saudi Arabia. The concept of blocking of Russian oil from entering in the markets was definitely going to enter into the category of imposing such a self-risk for the international community that it would raise prices that you simply did not want to go there. And if you looked at the exports of Russian gas, a third of Europe's gas came from Russia. And so the prospect for Europe of doing without that gas was a non-starter. So from the beginning, the agreement was that we would have to take a different approach. It would not be possible to try to block Russian oil or gas from coming into the marketplace, but instead, the focus and the target was on blocking access to technology that would allow new developments in the Russian oil and gas industry, from the development of unconventional oil and gas, from the Arctic, from deep water. And the reason for that is that was the cutting edge of the industry. And if you can send a signal to the marketplace that that industry was constrained and developing, it would increase the cost of financing the debt and refinancing debt for individual companies. Right? And if you combine that with the fact that oil accounts for 70% of Russian export revenue, then this would have potentially a serious impact on Russia's ability to continue to expand its major source of revenue for the economy and for the budget. At the time that sanctions were imposed, I don't think anybody could have envisaged that we would have the developments that we'd have in the international marketplace that have taken oil from $110 a barrel to some band that has gone between 40 and 65 over the last 6 months. And the combination of that reduction of price and the jitteriness that we see in emerging markets today has had a huge impact on lowering Russia's GDP by close to 40%, of having a 45% impact on lowering the value of its currency, of having a huge impact on the ability of ordinary citizens to have security in their lives. And so you ask yourself the question, has this had the desired policy impact? Because we have to go back and remember the reason for these sanctions. They were based on Russia's annexation of Crimea and support for an insurgency in Ukraine. There was no military alternative that was available to address these issues, and there had to be something that was done. There had to be a response. And so sanctions became the avenue for action. And the frustrating piece, I think, for the entire international community is that you've had these sanctions, you've had a cut in prices, you've had an impact in capital markets, and still there has been no change in policy on the ground. And so the simple question to ask is, was this the right thing to do or not? And what do we do now? And what I would submit to you is that the answer was correct. If you look at the 21st century and ask, what do you do when a country violates the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of a neighbor? In Europe, do you have no response? Do you simply say it's a bad thing? Do you take actions that demonstrate that there is a cost? And I think in today's world of morality and international law, there had to be an action taken. There were few alternatives that were available on the table, but it still leaves us the question, with what do we do now? And unfortunately, we find ourselves still in this box of frustration. And the most critical thing that we have to maintain is unity and clarity, an understanding of why the sanctions were imposed, a recognition that until those conditions are changed, to back away from them will send mixed signals that will not result in a resolution between Russia and Ukraine in resolving the tensions that Ukraine has in the east and the south today. Engagement is still important. Trying to find a storyline that provides a success for Russia and Ukraine is important. I think those storylines are important. But one of the key factors that all of this will center on is the border between Russia and Ukraine. If that border can be sealed for the movement of military equipment and supplies, if there are observers that can be placed on that border, if there are observers that can be placed on the ground, that will create the foundations to resolve this issue tomorrow. And that is a decision which Russia can take tomorrow. And that is a decision that Ukraine can act on tomorrow. So the solution is not impossible, but it takes political will. And we have to maintain the unity and the clarity of purpose that's necessary to understand the rationale for action and why it's important to hold firm around a moral principle. Finally, let me just say a few things about climate change, Asia, the intersection of China. In Paris in December, the UN framework on climate change will have the 21st Conference of the Parties. And there'll be a fundamental change in the way the negotiations proceed. In the past, there have been negotiations that have been focused principally on what is the ideal path to resolve the problem of climate change. How do we get on the path and get an agreement across countries to be able to achieve that? And to be sure, that will still be part of the discussion. But in this Conference of the Parties, there will be a new dimension that is focused around a new acronym that we have in the international community, INDCs, Indicative National Determined Contributions. But they're founded on common sense. And they basically ask the question, if you can't get countries to agree on the ideal path, can you get countries to agree on what actions can be taken that will improve the problem, so that eventually when we get to the optimal solution, we haven't made things so bad that it's even harder and more costly to achieve an outcome and a solution. And so what we've already begun to see are countries such as the United States, Mexico, with China. The foundations of this were laid in the discussions between President Obama and President Xi a year ago. They have made their commitments to what they see as their INDCs, or intended nationally determined contributions. The problem that we will face in this kind of an approach is whether those INDCs are realistic. And I would submit that one of the critical issues is that, first of all, we have to gain the participation of the non-OECD countries. And secondly, we particularly have to find a way to be able to address these issues in Asia. With the non-OECD countries, the rationale is pretty obvious. If you look at energy use over the next 25 years, energy demand is flat in the OECD, the United States, Europe, the advanced countries of the world. And all of the growth is in the non-OECD countries. So if we want to find a solution that is able to reduce emissions sufficiently to keep the temperature of the planet from rising more than 2 degrees centigrade, we have to fundamentally find a way not just of having the more advanced and rich countries reduce to create the space for the developing economies, but you can't find a solution unless those developing and emerging markets are also part of the solution. They have to be encouraged and feel the confidence that this is a global solution that includes them, that includes the United States, that includes Europe. And Asia is particularly key, and I'll just give you this example from Southeast Asia. Today, coal constitutes 30% of the fuel mix in the ASEAN countries. By 2035, it's projected to increase to 50% of the fuel mix. Countries like China are making radical changes that are adjusting the increase of the rate of coal use. The share of coal in the overall fuel mix is decreasing, but if you look at the absolute volumes, they are not. And if you look at a country like India, the use of coal is increasing at 4 or 5% a year. So if we can't resolve these issues in Asia, we can't come to a global solution. And how do we change that? Two things I want to raise or suggest. If we come back to the question of changing the fuel mix, one of the critical issues is going to be investment flows. What kind of investment and what is going to drive that investment? And in the end, we have to ask ourselves the question, why are companies and banks and financial institutions investing in coal? The reason they're investing in coal is they make a higher rate of return and it's more profitable. And if you can't change that equation, we won't change the outcome on the fuel mix. And so we have to bring together a set of actors. Governments that have an opportunity to make policy choices that, for example, can affect whether there is a price of coal in the market. And that may not necessarily be a price on carbon, but you can do what China did, which is to put a limit on particulate matter that de facto increases or establishes a price of coal. You have to have financial institutions involved because in the end, the rate and the terms on which you can borrow capital are going to have a fundamental impact on the attractiveness of renewable energies. You have to involve energy developers because they're the ones that are going to be critical to bringing together these solutions. And you have to involve the development community because we're going to need their help and support analytically and with financial instruments. And so one of the questions, and I'll put it in a very practical sense, because in my mind, one of the key examples of this is, it brings us to Indonesia. How do you create the set of conditions with policy, financing, prices, and energy development that will allow for an investment in geothermal instead of coal? Very basic question, specific to the country, specific to the resource. And here's the other part that I'll mention to you. In the United States, we have had an extraordinary set of measures that have been proposed with a Clean Air Plan. We may think of that as a domestic set of actions, but without that Clean Air Plan in the pocket of the U.S. negotiators in December, the United States will be feckless in its negotiations in the Conference of the Parties. Because in the end, for others to agree to act and move forward, they're going to have to see the richest nation in the world serious about its commitment to act. And the most serious and effective measures that we have today are embedded in those incentives that are going to be created on changing the fuel mix internally within the United States and how we can affect those choices on a state-by-state basis. And so those domestic actions, those actions which we see through a domestic lens here in the United States, fundamentally have an impact on the ability to form and sustain coalitions that are critical to the viability of a climate change solution. I hope in these examples that one of the things that you can see is that these questions of energy are just fundamentally intertwined with the fate of countries, with the fate of national security, with our future and its sustainability, with the prosperity that people may have throughout the world. And in that sense, for me, it gives me great pleasure to be able to talk about these issues and have these discussions at Columbia University. Because another challenge that we face is to help develop and shape the minds that are going to be critical in leading these public policy debates, who can have an influence in the way decisions are taken in the business sector. And here, Jason, I raise a glass, not now, a hat, I'll raise a glass to you later, to the role that the Center for Global Energy Policy has played. Because the way that you're taking on these questions, shaping the minds of young people, is playing a huge and central role in the public policy of our country, of the world, in our national security, and in the prosperity that people can have in their lives. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Is this thing on, as they say? Could it? Yeah, it is. Yeah, well, thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Pascual. Thank you for that fascinating talk and the introduction to your report. I'm particularly enthused about the Rules of Six, which I think is a really terrific, powerful and rigorous framework for thinking about energy policy, and I think it's certainly something I'll be looking at in the future, and I think a lot of other people would find it useful as well. And if you haven't seen it yet on the site and in the report, I would urge you to take a look. Just perhaps to kick off our discussion, I just wanted to think a bit about our title here. We're talking about the new geopolitics of energy. What's new about them? I mean, are you thinking about shale here, and is it about the US energy revolution, or is there more to it than that? And perhaps, Ambassador Pascual, if I could start with you, but I'd also like to throw that open to the rest of the panel and see what they think. Again, I mean, we were talking about sort of the changes you saw just in the past 5 years. What other people think is kind of new at the moment?
Ed, it's a very good and practical and obvious question, and indeed one of the things that I'm doing in cooperation with Columbia University is taking this paper and turning it into a book, and hopefully by the time I get to the end of the book, I'll figure out what's new. No, there is a real new here, and one of the things which is new is the fact that climate change is a critical part of the geopolitics of energy today. We wouldn't have thought of that 20 or 30 years ago. We traditionally, in the past, have thought about geopolitics of energy as issues that fundamentally affect wealth and power. But it's become much deeper. There are climate issues that are central. The people who don't have wealth and power have also become fundamental to the geopolitics of energy. If we think of the 1.2 billion people in the world who don't have access to electricity, it also raises the question of what kind of instability gets created when they don't have the ability to better their lives, when there are differences within countries, such as India, that have huge populations that don't have access to energy. And so the questions of poverty have become also a fundamental part, not just because of the way the rich might influence those countries that don't have energy, but in fact the instability that might arise from those countries and how they'd affect global markets and our energy interests and needs over time as well. And so one of the points that I've tried to make in the paper, and I hope to make in the book as we elaborate on it, is that this intersection of geopolitics at times comes from those who have wealth and power and energy and how they influence others. But there are markets involving energy that are influencing all of us, including those who are wealthy. And the new geopolitics of energy is that we have to understand that reciprocal relationship, because it's not just a one-way street. And the way that other countries can affect us should have a fundamental impact on the way that we think about these energy security issues.
Thanks very much. Mona Sutphen, perhaps to turn to you. And as you've thought about this, both in government, public service, and in the private sector, what do you think is new?
Yeah, so I actually am going to go to the U.S. answer. And it's new because not just the shale point, but the point that Carlos was making, which is it's less about the evolution of shale in the United States and more how other countries impose their concerns, worries, and fears about U.S. behavior as a result of that. Almost in a way, I've seen this in real time as well. Countries anticipate that there'll be a change in policy posture by the United States because of the rise of domestic energy resources. But we're still grappling, I think, with how to understand policymaking, because we haven't, it's been a field, but we've really been participants in it, observers in it. We haven't been able to shape it in the same way we have been able to now. And I actually think that causes a lot of risk in the system, in that, and as a policymaker, and Carlos I'm sure can attest to this, and Jason as well, if you have tools in your tool arsenal, and as you develop them, you're more likely to use them. And you see this in the case of sanctions. It's become a preferred tool relative to, say, pinpoint strikes airstrikes and other kinds of military activity. So I think the United States is just beginning, literally just taking the few first steps out the door of really understanding what the shale revolution means for the United States in the world, while everybody else has already started to think about it. So I think we're actually kind of slow to the table from that perspective, and it's a big, big deal.
Thanks very much. Michael Levy, one thought that occurs to me, as Mona says, we're just at the beginning of a journey of kind of understanding this. We're also at the point where now US oil production is falling, and if you believe the IEA is set to fall again next year, is it possible there's going to be a new geopolitics of energy? And if we were to have this gathering again in a year's time, we'd be thinking about it again very differently. Is the situation...
It depends on what you mean by new.
Right.
First, I have to say, it's a fantastic paper. I assume, Ed, that next time you call any of us for an interview, you'll be going methodically, column by column through it, asking us questions, or at least I hope so. And maybe hand it over to some editorial writers, too. So, in part, I think it's not new, right? There are a lot of dynamics that always existed, but each of the players operating within the system have different abilities, strengths, weaknesses than they did before. So it's sort of, if I take a chessboard and I rearrange the pieces and I remove some and I add some, okay, it's still chess, but it's a very different game because the players are starting with different attributes, strengths, weaknesses. So I think that's a bit of what's happened. That said, I do think the game itself is a bit different, and Carlos pointed to climate as a major piece of that. I think another also goes to the heart of what's in his paper. And the last time people really drilled down on energy and geopolitics in this country, at least, was in the 1970s. And the nature of global markets has changed fundamentally since then. Forget who's producing, who's consuming. We have spot markets for trade in global oil. We have far different capital markets, both within countries and globally. And so when Carlos emphasized, I think rightly, the importance of understanding how market dynamics discipline what you can and can't do when it comes to geopolitics, what's new in a big way is that those market dynamics are very different from what they used to be. I think that's pretty important for people to get right.
Thanks very much. Iain, Conn, you probably know more about those than anybody else in this room. How do you see it from the industry's perspective, and as a CEO and a director of a couple of the world's largest energy companies over the past few decades, what do you think is really new now?
Well, I think, let me start with what's not new, which is that energy and geopolitics have been inextricably linked for forever, and that's because of our dependency on it, because of its propensity to generate wealth, and because of its linkage to power. But what is new, and I agree with Michael, that the bottom line is that the world of geopolitics and energy has been very unpredictable over the last 30 years. When I started work in energy, we were dreaming about Russia, China, and Vietnam being open to foreign investment. We had civil wars going on in Mozambique and Angola that were prohibiting investment. We had relatively stable Iraq, Libya, and other locations like that. And lots is unpredictable, and the geopolitics of energy will always be complex. What is new, and therefore why Carlos's framework, intellectual framework, is so important, is that the number of participants is much larger, and the number of participants with significant capability to use geopolitics to impact the world's energy balance is significantly greater than it was before.
And sorry, to be clear about that, participants in the sense of what? Energy-producing countries, or?
Participants who are either shapers of the energy balance or are much more fundamentally dependent upon it. So China, in 2004, burst onto the world in terms of its net demand for energy, and it was the single biggest thing that drove us to $140 a barrel of oil. China's hugely dependent on imports now, paranoid about its security, and massively powerful. Quite a few of those parameters were less distinctive or significant even 10 years ago. And so China's an actor that's very material here. India's an actor that's very material. We were talking, Carlos talked about Iran. We've seen Russia now opened up and now partially closed down. It's a very complex picture, and having an intellectual framework like this is very useful.
Thank you. Jason, did you want to come on this?
Yeah, just briefly. I guess I would say there are some things that are not new. there are some things that are changed but may not continue to be changed, right? So there were some things we saw when we were in government, some of us dealing with Iran sanctions. The fact that the U.S. was putting 1 million barrels per day per year on the market changed the thought process on what it would mean to pull 1.5 million barrels of Iranian oil off the market. It's not clear to me that that's a sustainable change. We're not going to have a step change in U.S. shale output like that again, so unexpected, right? So some of those things we saw as one-time impacts on geopolitics, but it's not clear to me they're replicable. And then there are some things that will continue to go on and have ongoing impacts, perhaps, we don't know. Obviously, one of the most significant now, I can't tell you with any certainty whether it will continue, is the fact that many consuming countries have been saying for decades that we would prefer that there not be entity controlling the oil market and that there be a relatively free market that works and sets price based on supply and demand. And for the first time, that's kind of what we're getting. And now we're going to figure out if we really want that. And that is in part related to the U.S. shale boom, among other factors. But from the Texas Railroad Commission to OPEC, Standard Oil, and John D. Rockefeller years before, there has been at least one entity in some form of measure controlling global oil markets, and that is, for the time being, not the case. In fact, OPEC has increased production. We have a very small buffer of spare capacity in the market to handle any disruption, and we're going to see how the U.S. responds to that. And then the question, I think, that Carlos can speak to better than anyone about how we engage in foreign policy and diplomacy, and is it any different when you're having a producer-to-producer conversation rather than a consumer-to-producer conversation? When I was in government, leaders from Eastern Europe and others and Asia would show up every week and say, when are we getting your natural gas? And now we're talking about oil and all these other things. How does that fit into your toolkit, as Mona was saying, when you think about negotiations and diplomacy and kind of trades that you want to make with foreign governments?
Indeed, and that was exactly the question I wanted to come to next, as you say, is to really pick up on Mona's point about one of the big sort of the developments, one of the real variables that's been at play here is the question of other countries, other regions' responses to the enormous changes we've seen in the United States. And Iain, I was wondering if I could just get you to talk a bit about that, because it's probably something a lot of people here would find interesting as a kind of an outside perspective. When you look at what's been happening in the United States from a European perspective, how has it kind of changed the way Europeans think about energy, and what are kind of some of Europe's concerns, both in terms of kind of opportunities and potential risks and threats?
Well, I think Carlos referred, first of all, to the G192, the UNFCCC process, and Europe has been leading in the climate change action agenda. I think most people would agree with that for the last 20 years. Europe's finding itself in a very interesting place, a difficult place. First of all, Europe currently produces 4 billion tons out of the world's 35 billion of CO2, and it's actually going to be 3 billion out of 41 in another 10 years' time or something. So Europe's less than 10% of the problem, but it's trying to lead. And I would put it to you that some of the changes that have happened have meant European energy costs are now twice those of the United States. European labor costs are twice those of Asia. And Europe can't afford to be the single leader in the climate change debate anymore. It cannot afford to be too far out in front. Another impact of what's happened in the US is that cheap coal has been displaced by shale gas in the US, flooding the European market. And as Carlos referred to the economics of coal generation, we have got a market failure in Europe where brand new gas-fired power stations with a quarter of the CO2 emissions per unit capital are being shut in favor of coal-fired power stations being run flat out. So Europe has a large number of problems to deal with, and I would put it to you, it cannot continue to be trying to be so far ahead, and Europe needs to reflect on how it engages to create a solution around G3, itself, the US and China, because if those three can align philosophically, the rest of the world will follow. There is one benefit that Europe could get out of all this, which is exports of LNG from the US, not in large volume, but sufficient to keep the price of gas in Europe capped to some degree. That is the one benefit I see, but Europe has got a huge number of problems to confront, and I don't think it's dealing with it very well right now.
And if you want to know the impact of U.S. exports on European gas prices, find the study on the Center's website that we did about a year ago.
And what about exports of US crude for European refineries? Is that something that would be welcome?
I think that's less of an issue, and it's a bit of a red herring. First of all, the U.S. refineries, I used to run all BP's refineries. Refineries can export oil as product now. So it's not, I really don't think the crude oil export ban issue is as significant as people make out. The other thing that is important to remember, you can move a barrel of oil anywhere in the world for $4. To move the same amount of energy as LNG costs $45. Actually, oil's quite a fungible commodity, and I don't think the export ban or the lifting of it will have a particularly big impact on Europe.
Thank you. Got a couple of questions here from the floor, which I'll come to in a moment. Just wanted one more thing that I just wanted to raise about U.S. exports.
Actually, I'm going to suggest, given that she's been so involved in the oil on combating the oil export ban, Jason is the author of a study completely disagreeing with Iain. So this is an opportunity to gang up on Iain, which I think
I would love to let you take that opportunity, but also just perhaps to put this in another context, something you raised earlier, where you talked about the idea of the U.S. as having, I mean, you didn't put it in these terms, but an energy weapon, that the U.S. energy exports could be a real kind of force globally for, possibly for foreign policy objectives or for certainly in kind of influencing markets. And, but anyway, I think it's the same question. We're interested in
2 points.
your
One,
views.
to Carlos's point on his framework, on the margin, that might be, in cases where you want to constrain exports, Iran is a perfect example because the increase in U.S. production had a meaningful impact in people's minds about what was possible and what might happen to them in terms of the self-risk that they had. So in that sense, it definitely has an impact. On the European front, I think that your answer is an actual markets answer, but as a politics answer, there's a reason why all the European governments are keen to get crude exports into TTIP, right? So this is a trade agreement. So I think there's a sense, like always with markets, everybody wants access to as much as they possibly can get so that they can diversify their supply mix to the extent that they can. And I think in the case of Europe, there's a fear that somehow crude exports might start flowing to Asia and not to Europe. And so in that sense, I think actually there is kind of a strong desire from a policymaker perspective, maybe in the market sense. Clearly there'd be a WTI Brent spread impact, but in terms of demand, I don't know that'll make a huge difference.
And at the very least, you mean to have the option of some crude
to have that,
flowing
just
to Europe,
participate in the market like anybody else.
Even if not many barrels actually
Correct.
do flow, sure.
Yeah, and if you believe there's going to be geopolitical risk in the Middle East, you could end up in a situation where the supply is just a safer source of, more stable source of supply.
So, I mean, a similar thought struck me as Carlos was speaking. I think this is an occasion where a change in energy policy can have a geopolitical impact because leaders don't necessarily understand how these markets work. And you have to be realistic about that. I think Carlos rightly recommends that all sorts of things be done to get leaders smarter about these, but the reality is that not everyone understands every detail of everything. And there are a lot of leaders that you can give them chart after chart and reports about fungibility of oil, and they still will feel better and be more able to sleep easily at night if they think that the United States is exporting oil and that they can have access to it. And no amount of market argument will necessarily do away with that. I think you have to accept that reality. If you're talking about what influences the politics and the political decisions of a leader, you're talking about what it is they believe about the world, not necessarily what a market analyst tells them to believe. I think the other piece, I think if you want to keep the Europe debate straight, I think you got to separate the desire of, in this case, petroleum refiners to get a little competitive edge, which will lead them to lobby for reduced export restrictions, and some pursuit of grand national security objectives. So often when you hear national security, what's really going on is a search for commercial advantage. I think that's just something that one always needs to be aware of.
That's a useful principle for life, I guess, not just in the oil market. Jason.
Yeah, no, I guess two things. So one, I mean, you asked about exports generally. So let me just briefly say on the topic of LNG exports, I do think that is a real issue that is going to change global markets. We're already seeing the impact of U.S. not just supply, but the nature of the contracts linked to Henry Hub without destination clauses, creating more competition in the global market, putting more pressure to move away from oil-linked pricing, and that's going to have and gas more than oil really has security of supply considerations for many Eastern European and other countries. So that is a big deal. When it comes to oil exports, I think to the extent it has an impact on other countries and has geopolitical impacts, there's sort of two different things. One is how it affects energy markets. And there, I guess the question would be, to the extent that allowing U.S. oil exports allows U.S. producers to fetch the world price and over time leads to a higher level of U.S. production, that there's some uncertainty about that, but directionally that should be the impact that has an effect for the United States. And then second, I'm curious, Iain, to hear more your thoughts on why you thought it wasn't a big deal to the extent European refiners are competing with U.S. refiners paying for discounted crude. Is that something that they would view as a competitive disadvantage or an issue? And then as we talk about in the study that we put out, separate from energy markets, I just think that there, and Mona and Carlos and others can speak to this, to the extent the U.S. is pushing for free trade agreements in Asia and in Europe, has spent 4 decades fighting for free and open markets and pushing back against trade restrictions on rare earth minerals from China and others. I think it challenges our ability to do that and undermines our credibility a bit when we're imposing our own restrictions on energy trade.
If I could just answer Jason's question a minute. Basically, I was answering the perspective of, in my view, the politician, in the sense that I don't actually think U.S. exports will massively change geostrategically the picture for Europe. I am a bit skeptical about TTIP. I think it's going to end up in a bit of a lowest common denominator set of solutions.
Yeah, that's a whole other.
But I certainly agree with you that from a commercial and markets perspective, it's better at the margin for Europe to have more choice of grades. But the US is still going to be importing an awful lot of crude oil and exporting at the margin also a lot of crude oil if the export ban gets lifted. So it won't really change the supply-demand balance that much. Therefore, I think it's a quality differential issue rather than a fundamental one.
Thanks very much.
And it would be an irony. I mean, if you look at all of the major oil exporters in the world, there's only one country in the world that has banned onyx exports, the United States. And it would be a huge irony if at some point Russia were to determine that it had to cut off its gas exports to Ukraine or its gas exports to parts of Europe because it did not comply with its domestic or national security interests. And we're setting a precedent that is only going to be hurtful, that is only going to be potentially used in negative ways. And so in that sense, from a geopolitical perspective, from the perspective that Jason argued about the importance of free markets, it's something that we should uphold. We've been a champion for free trade throughout the history of this country. And we have to appreciate Ian's point because he's right. We do export oil, quote, in the sense of exporting finished products. The commodity eventually does get exported, but by having the ability to export crude oil, it creates a competition in another set of products that we have that could bring additional benefits to the United States, that could allow producers to be able to get a higher price for those products. And eventually, in the study that Jason did and the study that IHS has done, actually lowers gasoline prices in the United States because it brings another source of light, tight oil into the international market that contributes to the quality of oil, the Brent crude quality of oil, which forms the international benchmark price for gasoline. So ironically, by exporting that oil, we actually contribute to lower gasoline prices in the United States as well. So that's why some of us have been saying, look, this is a win-win on economics for the United States, on geopolitics as well. And I selfishly, I think, just want for the four of us, it's too hard not to let that opportunity to go by to at least not put a perspective on that issue.
And then, of course, there is the other irony that's been discussed quite a bit in the past few weeks, that Iran's oil exports apparently are being liberalized at the moment, and yet the same is not true of the United States, which is a point you hear made quite a lot in Washington at the moment. So I'm going to come to questions from the floor in a moment. First, just a reminder that if you're listening to this or watching it, this is a discussion on the new Geopolitics of Energy at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. So yeah, I was going to take a question. There's this one always had to come. We weren't going to be able to get away from it. Discussion of the oil price. I'll throw this one open. Whoever wants to pitch in, I guess. Which is, to what do you attribute the precipitous drop in the oil price, and where's it going from here? Anyone want to hazard an opinion?
Take the first part so that someone else has to answer the second. I was joking. Supply has been greater than demand, and therefore the price has fallen. This is a really complicated analysis. And the question is why, unlike in the past where Saudi Arabia and others stepped in to balance markets, and this goes back to Jason's earlier point, why, unlike in the past, did that not happen this time? And I think you can come up with proximate reasons, like this time they thought that the supply would keep growing forever and they would have to keep on cutting their production until it was basically gone. Now it's not very good to prop up the price in exchange for not selling anything. It's not a good marketing strategy. But I think you can actually go deeper, because there are forces that Bob McNally and I have argued led Saudi Arabia to essentially stop playing this aggressive balancing role as far back as the mid-2000s. And so when you get a lot more supply than you have demand, and no one's stepping in to fix that, prices are going to fall precipitously. So simple answer. Now someone else can predict the future.
Iain.
Can I add?
Yeah.
Just that I think this has happened before, first of all. It happened in January 1986 when Saudi Arabia decided to pursue share, not support price. And it's happening exactly the same way again. Why is Saudi doing it? And the answer is, I think we're entering the very early stages of the end game of the use of hydrocarbons. And that might sound surprising coming from a guy that's been with BP for nearly 30 years, but that end game is going to play out over a very long period of time. But Saudi Arabia is looking at the world today and saying, hang on a minute, we've got low-cost, high-margin barrels. And what's happening at the moment is there's a whole bunch of really high-cost, low-margin barrels being produced in Canada, the United States, and Latin America. And the world ultimately should use our low-cost, high-margin barrels rather than those marginal ones. And there's a lot of slightly dodgy finance going into supporting these low-margin barrels in North America. And we are going to send a very strong signal that they do not automatically have a right to market share over the next 30 years. And that's what's going on. And it was triggered by Ali Naimi saying suddenly that Saudi will no longer defend $100 a barrel. Now you've got two forces driving prices down. Saudi Arabia is spending, relative to its cash break-even, something like $400 million a day, driving this policy. And it's heading towards the marginal break-even of the best shale barrels in North America, which is about $45 a barrel, and that's probably why we've bounced off $45 a barrel a couple of times. The second force that's keeping prices down is technology in North America, which, as the price is falling, innovation and technology are trying to keep up. I believe at some point, even Saudi Arabia is going to have to say, okay, we've done enough damage here, and I think the uncertainty around Saudi Arabia's actions going forward will mean that it will be very difficult for the price to go back to where it was before. So that's what I think is happening, and I think the range that we're going to see going forward, although you please must not buy or sell anything on the back of this, is $45 for the reason I've talked about, to probably something like $70, which is the marginal price of the really marginal barrel in the Americas. That's my simple analysis.
There's
Thank you.
also I was just going to chime in with a third factor, which is all of this is happening at the same time then that China's economic growth starts to slow, and we're starting to see that spillover effect. So when people ask me about the oil price, I say, well, when you tell me where China's growth story is going to go, then you'll know kind of the answer to this question. So.
You're correct.
Yeah, if I was any good at predicting oil prices, I'd be working at the other end of Manhattan and doing well from it. So I mean, look, no one saw not many people saw this collapse coming. It's always perilous to predict where oil prices are headed. But if you look at the fundamentals now, there's a reason, there's a consensus that prices are going to be lower for longer. As Iain said, there's an enormous amount of supply out there. There's an enormous amount in inventories, and there's a lot of fairly inexpensive supply that is coming online. Iran's coming back to the market. The Saudis have boosted production. Iraq is going strong, although we're starting to see that challenged a little bit. So there's a lot of supply out there, and as Mona said, there's not nearly enough demand to mop that up. Although we have seen demand respond to a low price, not surprisingly, and global oil demand projections are up probably about 500,000 barrels a day this year relative to what people thought they would be. This is totally uncertain. There's a lot of upside risk. We could see OPEC change course. We could see geopolitical disruptions in different parts of the world affect supply, and a low price makes the potential for geopolitical disruptions in many of those places perhaps greater, right? A few days ago, we at the center released a new study on the impact of the oil price drop on Venezuela, which was already experiencing severe economic and political challenges, and that is only exacerbated by the oil price drop. A lot of uncertainty about how supply, particularly in the U.S., will hold up. So we've seen, as Iain said, enormous productivity gains and cost declines, but whether they will continue to have the same access to capital markets, we're going to see hedges expire next year. We could see the potential for a sharper decline than some people anticipate. So there's a lot of uncertainty about this, but I think there's a reason most people think it's going to be low for a long time.
So it goes back to one of the things we were talking about earlier, what's new about the new geopolitics, the many different participants that are in the market, the many different participants that are affecting what the balances are and where price comes out. I think there's a huge amount of truth in the comments that were made across the panel, and none of them are contradictory. I mean, they're complementary points that all coexist with one another. One of the things that I would just sort of highlight a couple of points that are interesting. Before the price of oil started to come down in June of 2014, there were about 3.5 million barrels of oil in the market that were disrupted. And a factor that was driving the price of oil, or was keeping it between $105, $110 a barrel at that time, after the United States had over 3 successive years increased production by 1 million barrels or more a day over the course of each of those 3 years. So added 3.5 million barrels a day, more than a Kuwait, more than a UAE during that period of time, was the perception of political risk in the marketplace. And so an extraordinary thing happened in the summer of 2014 when suddenly some of those barrels that had been disrupted from Nigeria and Libya came back to the marketplace. And the market reaction was, oh my God, what if those 3.5 million barrels start coming back and instead of actually pushing the price up, radically depress it down? And that's when we started to see the fall. And then we saw another huge dip on November 27th of last year when Saudi Arabia and OPEC decided it was no longer to defend the oil price. If we add into this perspective, if you just take the countries of OPEC and put aside UAE and Kuwait and look at the price of a barrel of oil that every single country in OPEC, as well as Russia, needs in order to be able to either balance their budget or finance their exports. Somewhere between, let's say, $95 a barrel and $160. And so what it's telling Saudi Arabia is that if you're operating in this kind of environment, your friends and neighbors around you are going to keep producing because they're absolutely desperate. And if you look at it from Saudi Arabia's perspective and you think, oh my God, Iran's going to get a deal, my arch enemy, there's no way I'm going to give up my market share to be able to give that up to Iran. And then the final thing that I think is fascinating, and it goes back to Iain's point about productivity. The North American unconventional oil industry gained over 30% of productivity in the first 6 months of the year. 6 months of the year increased productivity by 30%. And so you had all of these reports of declining rig counts and declines in capital expenditures. And what happened to the actual production of oil? It actually went up 500,000 barrels a day. And so the marketplace is looking at this and saying, what? And so you ask, where's Saudi Arabia's response going to be? Well, Saudi has actually been pretty firm. They're still sticking with a high level of production in order to drive down the price of oil, get a cut in capital expenditures, and eventually get to a higher price. So all of these things, together with the demand story, are playing themselves out together. What we do have a reasonable sense for, especially with a market in which we have such an overhang of quantities in storage that are so huge, that the price of oil is going to be low for a period of time. Exactly where it's going to go, where that new equilibrium is going to be, we're going to wait till Jason actually goes to the other side of Wall Street and becomes extraordinarily rich and pronounces on that for us.
Just to quickly say, I mean, I just want to, Iain said something really important, which is that when we think about the downside risks, not in the next 6 or 9 months, but longer term, I don't think the market is not a collective entity, but generally speaking, energy markets have fully internalized what you said, which is that the pace of global hydrocarbon projected demand looking out into the medium to longer term is fundamentally inconsistent with what we know about climate science. And absent breakthroughs in CCS or some other way to reconcile these things, the potential for the demand outlook to see sharp tipping points, or the potential for people to sort of, for people who help determine the oil price and other hydrocarbon prices to take what you said more seriously and see and believe that policy will do what climate scientists tell us policy needs to do, that's sort of a huge wild card in terms of what the outlook could be for prices and the fate of the planet, obviously. But
indeed. Thank you. I've got quite a few more questions. I want to get to at least a couple more before we run out of time. One here about Russia, picking up on Carlos's second case study there. Someone wondering about the relationship between these oversupplied oil markets we've got at the moment and Russia. I mean, I guess you could say that the fall in the oil price is having a more serious impact on Russia actually than the Western sanctions are at the moment. But the question is there an opportunity here to do more in terms of sanctions against Russia? Could the West be putting more pressure on Russia? Because, as Carlos was mentioning earlier, so far the measures that have been taken don't seem to have been having a great deal of effect in terms of actually changing Russian policy. Thoughts on that?
I can start, and maybe others can pick up. So Russia's been put in a situation right now where it has a huge asset base, but it can't borrow. And it can't borrow because of a combination of two factors. The sanctions have precluded it from access to international capital markets, and its economy has suffered so much, and there's so much concern about emerging market debt, that it simply can't go to the marketplace and be able to borrow at rates that will make it competitive and economic for them to be able to use it effectively within their economy and to support the cost of production. So if you think about it from a perspective, of an auto manufacturer, for example, it's impossible for them to pay the foreign exchange costs and to pay the costs of capital and produce a product and sell it in Russia at a price that anybody can buy. Right? And so it's having a huge impact on the diversification of the economy itself. And so if you ask yourself, okay, are there additional sanctions that you can put in place on Russia? There probably are specific sanctions. There are probably individual sanctions that have a symbolic impact. But in terms of having yet a deeper, more significant impact on the Russian economy, it really kind of goes to what has been called by some the nuclear option, which is essentially that you eliminate Russia's access to SWIFT, something that was done with Iran, and you eliminate its ability to engage in international transactions. That is a huge, massive step, and it's one that, frankly, nobody wants to take. And so what I think it's presented us with a situation where the practical story that we have to address today is actually understand the importance, the value, and the strength of the sanctions package that we have. And if there isn't the kind of political solution and implementation of a Minsk agreement that will justify it, to stay unified and clear that this sanction package is going to stay. that it's not going to be abrogated. Some will argue that that at some point it may be necessary to say that if certain actions aren't taken, that eventually this larger nuclear option of going to eliminating Russia's participation in SWIFT potentially has to be put on the table. I think it would be simply impractical to consider today. There would not be the political will, particularly of the European players, to be able to go along with it.
Anyone else got ideas short of that for exerting
Just a
leverage?
comment on the European situation that Carlos commented about earlier. Just that, in addition to Europe importing a third of its gas from Russia, countries like Britain that have been on the more hawkish end of the Russian dynamic with Europe actually imports 50% of its natural gas. And if Europe didn't import a load of gas from Russia, there wouldn't be any to import into Britain from continental Europe. And I think this whole issue of European codependency with Russia on natural gas is both a good thing in terms of engagement. Russia needs Europe's market as much as Europe needs Russia's gas, but it's also a brake on the ability to press the nuclear button.
Thank you. Got a couple of questions here about the climate fund. A couple of people raising the question of changing the energy system, shifting away from fossil fuels, and how that is financed and organized, and what policies can be put in place to make that happen. Anyone got some thoughts on that? Michael, you said you didn't want to be asked about climate policy, but
I didn't want to only be asked about climate.
Well, you've had a chance to talk about other issues as well. So.
Carlos gave sort of the meta answer, which is it's going to need to be tailored on a country-by-country basis. Look, so basic starting point, the flows of capital we're talking about are enormous. They're only going to be mobilized by private players, but those private players won't do it unless they can make money. So public actors, whether that's on the helping side from things like development banks, or on the sort of hurting the worst source side, like carbon pricing, or what the Clean Power Plan will ultimately do, things like that have to come in so that those massive flows of private capital get redirected. You've started that question with the word climate fund. And I think that's interesting. It's interesting. I trust it reflects the questions. I think that these sorts of funds that people are building, like the Green Climate Fund, have a useful role to play in kickstarting some markets for cleaner energy sources, maybe in helping in some countries in adapting to climate change. But the reality is that the scale of change you need is ultimately going to have to be driven by national level policy changes that are implemented in part because countries and leaders care about climate change, in part because they're trying to accomplish other goals on security, on the local environment, on their economy. And those are going to have to redirect very large private capital flows. So I wouldn't put, it has a nice title, it's exciting, you can look at a particular fund, but that's not where I would put all the energy if you really want the level of change that's necessary to fundamentally reduce climate risks.
Thank you. And then final question, which I think is an excellent one to end on, just touching on some of the things that Iain and Jason were talking about earlier about the end of oil, essentially, and just thinking about, perhaps if we can speculate a bit about the long-term energy future. I think as the question's put, can we imagine the point where we no longer have to worry about the geopolitics of oil when it becomes a non-issue? And realistically, when might that be? I suppose one. Two, is it desirable? Is it something is it an endpoint we want to get to? And three, if so, how do we get there? Anyone want to speculate on that? When are we going to be able to stop having this discussion?
Can I just put the other bookend on my prediction about the beginning of the end game? I think we've got to be realistic that even in 2035, 2040, we'll probably be 75% dependent on fossil fuels. Oil's not the issue. Unabated coal is the issue, and it needs to be dealt with first. And oil is only used for transport and a bit of petrochemicals, and transport's about 20% of primary energy use. So we've actually got to realize that we've got to deal with power generation and coal. To answer the question, look, I've shifted from producing the stuff to actually trying to work on energy efficiency and changing the way customers behave. What's really exciting for me is the way we're using energy is starting to change all over the world, and people are getting that the one silver bullet we've got is energy efficiency and starting to figure out how to use new technology to change the energy mix. That is happening, but just to put it in context, the world spends $7 trillion a year on energy. It's 10% of the global economy, so it isn't going to happen quickly.
So we can book in here again in 25 years' time when we can be having all these same discussions again.
2100 would be a good place to aim for.
I think it's more like our great-grandchildren will be sitting around.
Indeed. Mona, did you want to come
No, I
on
was
this
just
one?
going to say maybe our great-great-grandchildren will be here having that.
And what about your thoughts on that? I mean,
Well-
in other words, it's totally unrealistic to think about shifting an energy system away from oil in our lifetimes.
Yeah, for the reasons we just articulated in terms of the scale, but I actually think Carlos's point and his framework is a really important one, because for the first time, I think we're really starting to have a serious dialogue on national basis. So China's need to deal with this for real, direct, potent political reasons, the United States feeling like we have to do something about this, is real, and it's going to have huge consequential change, I think. So we might be at a point where we move off the margins and start to move to the core, and we get to changing some of the financial flows that we've been talking about. So in 20, I could easily see that happening 5, 10, that we're really having a conversation about how this is unfolding in the market. So.
Thank you. Michael.
I think this points to a really difficult challenge, which is that policy-wise, we ought to be making very large efforts to reduce oil consumption, to bend that curve through technology, through policy, and so on. But at the same time, we need to be planning and building policy to promote security in a way that will work even if we are unsuccessful in that effort to reduce oil consumption. And that's kind of tricky, right? You want confidence so that there can be investment in the right places so that supply is diversified. But by the way, we're going to try to make it so that no one wants to buy it, right? That's challenging. And I don't think we've actually got a good handle on what it is you do to pursue both of those at the same time.
Carlos Pascual, you began this discussion. Do you want to round it off?
I think if we look at any projections of the future energy mix of the world, over the next 40 to 50 years, it's impossible to find any kind of projection that eliminates the use of oil. And so the challenge that we face is how to use it most efficiently, and how to be able to create the pressures to sustain in the overall energy system a cognizance and awareness and an investment structure that helps us keep at the same time moving to the lowest carbon fuels and alternatives to be able to use for different forms of economic activity.
I would just add to what you said. I mean, just to be clear, when you say under any projection of the future, that's not only projections of business as usual, but even if you look at the IEA or EIA sort of scenario where we do stabilize at 450 part per million, which is very difficult and worryingly unlikely at this point. You know, in I think the year 2040, fossil fuels are 60 rather than 80% of global consumption, and there's variance within that, right? Coal falls quite sharply, natural gas still rises, although less slowly than it otherwise would, and oil somewhere in the middle. So just to be clear, when you say projection, it's not like, well, if no one does anything and we're on the business usual case, even if more stringent actions are taken, that's still the case.
Now, I think that's a critical clarification, and what it just puts before us is, you know, first of all, this is topic over. We're no longer going to talk about the new geopolitics of energy, and is oil out of that equation? No, it's not out of that equation. Are the geopolitics of energy going to continue to change? Yes, they are going to continue to change, because there are going to be different factors on who has the ability to produce energy. Do all countries have the capacity to do it? What's the competitiveness of it? And those issues are going to still play into the marketplace. I think there's a debate that we're going to see more and more attention focused around. And on the one hand, the positive thing of what should be launched out of the climate change discussions in Paris is that there will finally be an approach to climate change that says that the best should not be the enemy of the good. And so those things that can be done should be advanced. They should be encouraged, and they should be part of the formal climate change process, and there should be accountability for them, and there should be transparency for that entire process. But there is going to be a gap between the good and eventually that which climate science indicates needs to happen in order to avoid the more cataclysmic effects of climate change. And that is going to be a geopolitical debate, because in the end, if we think of the world as having, in effect, a carbon budget, the question is going to become, where's it going to go? And are the industrialized countries going to cut back sufficiently to allow within that carbon budget the emerging economies to take up more of that space? And within those emerging economies, is there going to be a recognition that if we don't all play in this game, then we're going to still have the outcome and we're all going to die? All right? And so we all face this challenge of trying to work through this together and come to an understanding of how we reach agreements that does this in a way that is effective, that is economic, and allows us still to achieve and sustain the quality of life that we need and want for the planet. And that is it's almost harsh to call it a geopolitical game because the stakes are too high to call it a game. But it is something where the geopolitical interests of different parts of the world are going to come to play. And the stakes are enormous. And how we play into that is something which does need to be a matter of public policy. It needs to be an issue of the attention to business. It needs to be an issue of attention to universities and academic institutions. But here's also the positive thing, that if we take it seriously and find creative ways to approach it, we can also make it a foundation for commercial activity. And so that's one of the things that I've been trying to stress is let's find the business opportunities to be able to do this. And let's turn this opportunity to actually create a strategy for the survivability of the planet into something which also opens up new aspects for business, new aspects for economic growth that allows us to achieve sustainability as well.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that. As you say, it is a very daunting challenge, but thanks a lot for your thoughts on how to begin thinking about it and how to tackle it. Thanks a lot to the whole panel. I've found it absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you very much indeed. Iain, Conn, Pascual. Thanks a lot. Apologies to everyone whose question didn't get answered. I had a load of great questions, couldn't get to them, so sorry about that.
On behalf of the Center on Global Energy Policy, I want to thank Ed Crooks from the FT for moderating, thank all our panelists. You could find Carlos's study on our website, energypolicy.columbia.edu. Our next event is on Monday, a conversation about how China can meet its climate goals with Center Fellow David Sandelow, who's sitting in the back over here. And then the following Monday, on September 28th, in this room, we'll host the UK's Energy Secretary, Amber Rudd. If you can't join us, our events are always available to watch live online, to consume after the fact online, or through our podcast series on iTunes, and you can always follow us on Twitter at Columbia U Energy. So thank you again for joining us, and thank all our panelists.